Welcome, welcome. What an amazing image. We focused in on the inner corona near one of these tornadic active regions. We showed you how they pulled in particles from the corona and how, because there were more particles, these tornadic regions were becoming more prominent, more visible, more frequent. And this really shows you the incredible surge in a wave of particles coming in. You have sparse particles, and all of a sudden there's a surge of this flashing, these dots. Pinpoint emissions are what they are called. Those are places where there's particle collision and ionization happening, creating flashes of intense energy. In this case, it's 33 nanometer radiation, which is the ionization frequency and the ionization radiation given off when helium loses an electron, but also when there's collisions of helium atoms. So the changes in the solar system, we get to the boring part here. It's very telling when you read these NOAA reports, because it's the only place where they admit what's going on. They don't give you an explanation, and they actually give you a bogus reason for what you're seeing, but they admit it. And always, always, the low energy, the 2 MeV, milli electron volt electrons, the low energy electrons are always at high levels, almost all the time. Meanwhile, the proton flux is at background level. Now, they explain this by a negative polarity coronal hole streams. And man, we have had so many negative polarity coronal hole streams. We've had thousands of them in the last 3 years. And it's always a negative polarity coronal hole stream that's giving you all these electrons. Well, here's a problem. Even though a coronal hole may have a negative polarity, the research and all the evidence and all the literature will tell you that protons and electrons being released out of coronal holes exist in the same ratios. Why? Because those electrons come from the protons. And there's always, in hydrogen, which our sun is a hydrogen fusion star, the hydrogen only has one electron. So you have one proton for every electron. So when they ionize and they get released, you have equal ratios of protons to electrons. But here now, for the last 5 years, they've been admitting high electron flux, background protons. Oh, that's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, that would explain a lot. That explains, indirectly, the flashing you saw in the corona of the sun. Because when helium loses an electron, that creates extra electrons. And when you have helium-3, helium-4, and lithium passing through the corona of the sun, those absorb protons. We showed you those chemical reactions. So you have something that's absorbing protons and donating electrons. And why are our electron counts so high? And it's very important because this is killing Earth, all this extra energy. But to prove we know where this brown dwarf is, we're going to go and look at the magnetosphere data. I get tired of showing this because it's the same thing over and over again. But Earth is coming right at you, and the sun is off to the right. Planet X is where? Planet X is behind the screen and up 30 degrees. So Planet X is at the wall and up 30 degrees. So it's coming at you, these particles, but at a downward angle. So then you see that when you have an influx of particles, that's that red bars that are passing right to left. Those particles kind of crimp the magnetosphere. There's a crease that runs down the length of the magnetosphere. One problem, okay? To crimp the magnetosphere, you have to have pretty high speed particles and a lot of them. But wait a minute, the protons are at background levels only. Also, what's curious is those curling balls, those coiling lines of our magnetosphere that get ejected into the tailstream. Those do not occur when there's a passage of those red bars, those red particles that increase concentration. Notice right here, the coiling is starting before the high concentration even hits our magnetosphere. Now that is an indication of a coronal hole stream because the electrons are traveling faster than the helium. And so electrons get here first, the helium gets here second, and the protons get here third. That's the speed. And yet, when there's no particles coming in from the right, we see ejection after ejection of this swirling yarn ball, this ball of yarn that gets ejected into the tailstream. It almost looks like a cannonball being shot out of a cannon. And all of a sudden you see, all of a sudden the tailstream just turns blue to light blue, just over like in a matter of seconds. Well, that's the penetration of the particles that are coming from a different direction. And they swarm in through the magnetosphere, increasing the concentration and changing the color on the simulation. This magnetosphere diagram, I like it because it shows you the position of the satellites, a couple of the satellites, but it measures energy. Now, energy sometimes is a function of concentration, but we see dark blue should be almost no particles, but yet we have significant compression down to 7 Earth radii. And notice also there's like a fishtail that always comes off on the left-hand side. Sometimes when there's an expansion of energy, you can't see it. But there's 2 lines, one going off to the upper left corner, one going to the lower left corner. And the greater concentration of energy is always, always, always in this simulation towards the lower left-hand corner. Now, why is that? The sun is off to the right, we're having uniform particles come through, then why would the lower left-hand part of the tailstream be always showing you higher energies than the upper right-hand corner? And that's because the particles are coming in from above and they're being focused and concentrated below on the simulation. So it's acting like a windsock in showing you exactly where these particles are. And notice when there's ever an increase in energy in the tailstream, it expands the magnetosphere, and yet there's no particles coming through. So it's particles that aren't being registered, only the energy is, and it gets concentrated on the backside of Earth, and when it reaches a maximum critical mass, it ejects. Well, that's the behavior of an electron. Electrons repel one another. You can only pack so many into an area. Again, look at the lower left-hand yellow streak going off to the lower left-hand corner. That's indicative of particles that are coming in from above. So, are we not accurate on where this brown dwarf is? And as I run backwards, notice the satellites going backwards. Notice that the trailing satellite on that white dotted line, that's geosynchronous orbit at about 5 Earth radii, 6 Earth radii, goes 16 past in between or past behind the Earth and Planet X. And that's significant because we're going to show you what happened to that instrument when it was measuring the X-rays as it passed behind the Earth. Now this simulation, we're going to look down on Earth, and Planet X is directly above your screen on your computer up at the roof, and the particles are coming down. And you notice close to the Earth, right near the top of the Earth, in this way it's, you know, if you're looking down, Earth is headed towards the bottom of the screen. But you'll see a constant shifting of those arrows, the vectors, is the direction of particles. And there's always particles swirling in tight, close to Earth. Well, that's because particles, neutral particles, are going right through that magnetosphere and changing the directional flow. And again, we notice these balls of particles being ejected into the tailstream. And it's not even related to the particles that are coming in from the right. When we have particles coming in from the right, like you see right now, it crimps the magnetosphere all the way down the tailstream. But then we have an expansion, like a cannonball being shot out into the tailstream. That again, electrons reaching critical mass and jetting out into the tailstream. And for years, scientists had wondered what was causing the electron jets coming from Jupiter. Well, there's more electrons in the solar system, and now we see that the ones that pass, the low energy electrons, get pulled back around and focused into the equator, where they build up a critical mass and then get ejected through the process of repelling each other. Electrons repel each other. They do not attract one another. So when you get too many, they have to go. They cannot stay, and they shoot out and are repelled into the tailstream. Again, when the red bars come passing through, it crimps the magnetosphere. But here's the thing. Noah already told you protons are at background levels. So if we're looking at background level protons, what's crimping the magnetosphere has to be other particles. And that would be the helium-3 and helium-4. And what happened to the protons? I mean, they're supposed to be in equal proportions to the electrons. They're blaming it on a negative coronal hole stream, but still negative polarity or positive polarity. You still have to have very narrowly defined ratios, and we're not seeing that. We're seeing a huge disparity between the number of protons and the number of electrons, which should never happen because those electrons come from the protons. One electron for every proton. Now this is the magnetosphere standoff position. The magnetosphere standoff position should be anywhere between 10 and 14. That's where it usually averages prior to 2011. But now we see it compressed frequently by a constant pressure. So you can't have a constant particle pressure created by electrons because electrons repel each other. You have to have a particle pressure created by protons or some other particle that's large enough and has a mass to create a wind, like pressure from a wind. And when it's constant like this, then you have to assume there's a constant flow of these particles. And since we don't have a coronal hole stream every single second of every single day, 7 days a week, then you have to assume there's another source of particles and additional particles that are putting pressure upon our magnetosphere. Now, the NOAA report talked about electron flux being high. And when it got high, look what happened to our standoff position. It bumped up between 10 and 12 Earth radii. So, again, everything's matching the aspect of a second wind. And because the protons are disappearing, you're looking at lithium and helium-3 that are scavenging those protons. It all adds up. And this extra energy is what's killing the coral. And here's the extra energy. This is X-rays. Now, we know, because all the other photon measurements have been tampered with. We can't measure extreme ultraviolet like we used to. We can't measure regular ultraviolet. We can't measure all of those in-between ultraviolets. We can't measure any of it because those instruments I used to show almost 3-4 times a week for weeks upon end, and they forced NASA to pull down those instruments. So now all we have is X-ray flux. Well, I'm showing you the current X-ray flux of GOES 16. GOES 16 shows you an X-ray flux greater than a baseline of 10 to the minus 8. Well, why is that even significant? Well, in 2011, we're in a solar maximum. We were starting to have coronal mass ejections. We were starting to have comets hitting the sun. Lots of them, big ones. And yet, look at the baseline for the X-rays, 10 to the minus 9. So if we had 10 to the minus 9, even when we had more sunspots than we do now, why in the world then isn't the 2011 background baseline up where it is today? Something has increased our X-rays. We are now 10 to the minus 8 on our baseline short, high energy X-rays. What did that? Why isn't it back down to 10 to the minus 9 where it was in 2011? Also, notice the light blue line from GOES 16 bottoms out 24 hours apart from one another. And we have to either say that's an electronic malfunction, or somehow GOES 16 must have passed behind the Earth and used Earth as a shield and could not detect the X-rays. And when we, indeed, I just showed you, well, GOES 16, in fact, passed behind the Earth. And so is it any coincidence that all of a sudden the X-rays being measured flatlined? What was that about? So again, when I saw this flat line, I said, well, GOES 16 must have passed behind the Earth. And then I turn on this simulation, and what do we see? We see GOES 16 passing behind the Earth. But the more important thing is that the short wave radiation of X-rays is up to 10 to the minus 8, which is 10 times higher than it was in 2011 when we had more sunspots. And more sunspots brings more X-rays. So you go figure. It's right there in front of you. 10 to the minus 8 today, 10 to the minus 9 in 2011, when we were going into solar max. How does that happen? So then we pulled away using SOHO, and again we put the contrast on there to see these flashing particles. And indeed, I don't remember seeing so many. And no wonder the sky has like a filter in it, and you can't see the stars as brightly as we used to. There's all these particles in the way. Some of them are creating background light, which then competes with the starlight, but also acting as a filter, putting a mesh between you and a light source of the constellations, which is why the sky has dimmed. But even under white light, you can see the sparking. And I remember in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, not this much sparking. Of course, solar maximum pushes these cosmic rays out. And so we're waiting for that to happen. And it's happening very slowly, but it's happening. And we need it to happen. We need these cosmic rays to be pushed away and pushed around the solar system. So that's the end of the update today. And good news, we got the hard drive off the other computer. I was just going through some of the data files. There are so many things that had been taken down on the last channel that we now have access to those videos. We will be putting them up with some amazing Mars videos, some amazing UFO videos, some really incredible stuff that we had stumbled across. And we're going to put those up, and the first rights and the first viewing and the premieres are all going to go to the Patreon subscribers at A Higher Truth Rises on the Patreon account, because those people are the only reason I'm still here. They have to be rewarded, so they get first crack at all the great stuff now, and then YouTube, we come back 3, 4, 5 days later and then make some of them public. The Bigfoot videos will not be public. We have one Bigfoot video that was made public on our YouTube channel, but all the Bigfoot videos will remain unlisted because those are just very special videos with real evidence, with real experts, and so we just want to reward the Patreon subscribers. We need to do that. So until next time, thanks for listening, and be prepared, not scared.